Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Echoing Margaret Thatcher, Gordon Brown is insisting that on the nuclear issue, there is no alternative. He insists that if we want to cut carbon emissions and reverse climate change, we have to consider nuclear expansion as a vital component of our new energy policy. But the Prime Minister is wrong. There are safer, greener, cleaner alternatives. And with me to discuss those alternatives, how much they'd cost, how much energy they can generate, is Roger Higman, Campaigns Coordinator of Friends of the Earth. Welcome, Roger.
Welcome, thank you.
Perhaps you just tell us, why is Gordon Brown so wrong when he puts so much emphasis on the nuclear option?
Nuclear power is a dirty technology, it's an expensive technology, and it's a technology that is intimately associated with nuclear weapons. We're concerned that by going back to nuclear, we're going to create waste that will stay radioactive for tens of thousands of years, and also set an example that other countries will follow and make it very, very difficult to stop them from introducing weapons programs under the guise of combating climate change.
So you're thinking about Iran, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, Iran is saying it's doing exactly what it's legally entitled to do. The International Atomic Energy Authority is supposed to help Iran do exactly what it wants to do. It's enriching uranium. Yet Western leaders are worried, and we have good reason to believe, that Iran is misusing that enrichment technology, which is a nuclear power technology, to enrich uranium for weapons making. So the technologies are intimately linked, and if we go down the nuclear route, it's going to be very difficult to persuade other countries not to.
Yeah. In terms of, you know, the whole option in this country and the cost and those kind of issues, what are we talking about?
Well, the government says that we need about 10 new nuclear reactors. Their idea is we're going to replace the existing reactors that we've got, which are going to be slowly coming out of service. Some have already been decommissioned. Others will last as far as maybe 2023, or in one case, Sizewell, 2035. At the moment, those reactors are generating about 20% of our electricity, and our electricity is about a third of our overall energy needs. So it's a significant sector, and the government's idea is that we will replace those with a new generation of reactors, about 10 reactors in all.
And how much is an average reactor going to cost? I know it varies on the model and everything, but...
We're talking billions of pounds. We're talking about £3 or £4 billion per reactor. The final costs aren't known, though, and the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology has said that no one can ever know what the full cost is going to be, because the cost depends enormously on how quickly the reactors can be built, whether the same reactors are built one after another, or they build 10 different types of reactor, what the construction delays are, and so on. So nobody knows the final cost, but whatever it's going to be billions of pounds.
So probably a ballpark figure of 30 to 40 billion pounds for 10 nuclear reactors.
Yeah, and that doesn't include the long-term costs of managing nuclear waste. We're talking another 20 to 30 billion pounds already for a deep repository to keep the nuclear waste we've already created, and this new programme is going to add to that nuclear waste, and so there are costs associated with that as well.
So in terms of economics, the viability of nuclear just doesn't really stack up.
Well, it all depends on the price of electricity, and I think this is the key criteria. The nuclear industry argues that if it can get the construction going quickly, if it can keep construction time to a minimum, if regulation and public inquiries can be kept to a minimum, it can build the same reactor again and again and again and keep costs low. And if it's got a guaranteed price for the electricity, it's going to be cost-effective, it claims. The downside, though, the worry, is that there'll be cost overruns, there'll be delays, the price of electricity will vary, and that the nuclear industry will do what it's done in the past, end up dumping a lot of the costs for its waste disposal and what is known as the back end of the nuclear cycle on the taxpayer.
So I suppose what you're talking about really in part is huge cost overruns, the potential for huge cost overruns, like with the Scottish Parliament building or with Wembley Stadium.
Wembley Stadium. And we know what happened when we've had the private nuclear industry in the past in this country, because 4 years ago, British Energy, that owned the best nuclear reactors we had, it went bankrupt because it had paid out dividends, it hadn't put enough money aside to deal with the decommissioning of its reactors and the disposal of its waste. The expected cost of that began to mount up all of a sudden the city got very scared that the people who owned shares in British Energy were going to have to pay those costs, and the share price fell dramatically. It couldn't get money on the money markets, and as a result it had to go to the government for a very, very expensive restructuring project because it couldn't pay back the debts it owed. And so the worry always with the nuclear industry is that it may sound cheap, it may argue it's cheap, but that it'll put those costs back onto the taxpayer, and there's very little that the government can do to stop it from doing so.
Okay. Well, if we take that view, if we take that there are all these downsides of nuclear technology, we know that the government is trying to scare people into believing that, you know, basically there isn't an alternative to nuclear, that this is the only or the fundamental option we've got. What, in your view, are the viable, credible alternatives to nuclear?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is establish what are the government's arguments, and the government has two sets of arguments. On the one hand, they quite rightly are saying that climate change is the biggest environmental problem facing the world, and that we have to dramatically reduce the pollution from burning coal, oil and gas if we're going to reduce our impact on it and prevent climate catastrophe. That's fundamentally true. On the other hand, they've got this scare factor about energy security and the possible effect of what Russia's going to do as North Sea oil runs out and as more and more of our gas in particular comes from Russia and other unstable countries. So there's two arguments there, and we have to treat them slightly differently. Taking the security argument first, an awful lot of our gas is actually not used for electricity generation. About 2/3 of our gas is used in people's cookers, people's central heating systems, and so on. So a lot of other measures besides electricity generation can be taken to actually have an impact there. For example, in terms of central heating, we can save a huge amount of energy and gas from central heating if we insulate our homes better, if we fit double glazing, if we just simply turn the thermostat down a bit. Then, if we look at the electricity sources, there are a huge variety of different ways of generating electricity. We've got the potential for wind power, we've got the potential for wave power, we've got even tidal power, there's room for solar in this country, and there are other sources like hydro. Funnily enough, Britain has the best renewable energy source and supply of any country in Europe, but we scarcely use it.
So the potential is there, but it's just basically untapped.
Technically, the potential is enormous. The government's own estimates say that we can more than generate all the electricity we need from the potential of renewable energy. The question is then the cost. And we've done some figures taking government estimates, for example. And if you look at something like offshore wind power, which is what they're developing at the moment, we can generate the equivalent of 12.5 nuclear power stations worth of electricity from offshore wind. If you look at their own...
So we wouldn't need those 10 new reactors the government's proposing?
No. And if you look at the example of wave power, again, this is the government's own experts, the Carbon Trust, saying we can generate 20% of our electricity, turns out something like 8.5 new reactors simply from that. So the potential, there's an awful lot of different renewable sources. But the thing we have to remember, of course, is it's not just simply a question of replacing the nuclear supply. We also need to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions. And that's why we need to add them all up. We need to add up all these potentials for what wave can do, from what solar can do, from what wind can do, and then the potentials for energy efficiency and so on. And if you do that, and we commissioned the Tyndall Centre, the UK's best research centre for research on climate change, we commissioned the Tyndall Centre to do this addition for us using these government figures. And it's clear that in the next 30 years we can meet our climate targets without nuclear power.
Okay. Just taking, the alternatives one by one, you mentioned energy conservation. What are the best estimates at the moment about how much energy we could save if there was a serious comprehensive program of energy conservation?
Well, the best estimate was the one the government put in its energy review in 2002, before they even come up with this nuclear program. Then they said that we could save 1/3 of our energy use, not just our electricity use, 1/3 of overall energy use through cost-effective measures alone. This is through things that will actually save the consumer money. It includes things like low-energy light bulbs. If we replaced all our existing incandescent bulbs with low-energy light bulbs, that's the equivalent of one nuclear power plant. includes a crash program to improve the efficiency of industrial motors, the motors that are used in factories and so on. Again, if we did that, we could reduce energy by the equivalent of about 4 nuclear power stations. We've got things like smart metering in people's homes that will actually tell them how much electricity they're using, and that gives you another 1 or 2 nuclear power plants. Home insulation, more fuel-efficient cars. The potential's enormous through energy efficiency, and it's one that, by and large, will actually save us money, reduce our dependence on foreign fuel, and actually, in many cases, create new industries that we can then use to export technologies around the world and make us money as well.
So, really, what you're talking about here is energy conservation can cut our energy needs by about a third. It can, obviate the need for all these nuclear power stations.
And more.
And it can create lots of new skilled and semi-skilled jobs. Absolutely. That can boost employment and help the economy.
Yeah, if you look at Germany, there are over 1 million jobs in the German economy through green technology. Energy efficiency, waste technology, organic farming, and right across the economic sector, the Germans are market leaders on environmentally friendly technology. Yet we're not far behind, and we're creating dozens and dozens, hundreds, in many cases thousands of jobs now from new energy efficiency technologies, from organic farming and so on. And so by promoting renewable power, by promoting energy efficiency and things like renewable power, we do create jobs and we do provide industries for the 21st century that can then export technology as well.
Okay, let's look at another specific alternative, tidal power.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's been a lot of debate about the Severn barrage. I think many people in the Green Movement prefer the tidal pools option,
yep.
which is more environmentally friendly,
mm-hmm.
and is estimated to be able to generate about 6%
mm-hmm.
of Britain's entire electricity needs from that just one single project.
Mm-hmm.
Far more than any nuclear power station could ever hope. What kind of cost are we talking about to build the 7 tidal pools?
It's big. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We're talking billions of pounds there as well. And I think we have to accept that whatever we do in electricity supply, if we are going to replace nuclear, it is going to cost a lot of money. And in some cases, the cost is more expensive per kilowatt hour, per unit of electricity generated than nuclear. But in case of tidal, because it lasts so long, I mean, people have talked about a tidal barrage lasting for up to 100 years, and tidal lagoons generating electricity for 100 years. We can get very, very long-term loans on this and reduce the cost quite significantly. So the proponents, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree with everything they say, but the proponents are now saying that tidal lagoons can actually be cost-effective in the market now. What we need is decent permissions for them to build, but they don't need government subsidy. And that's a big plus in terms of getting them built.
Just for those who don't know, the idea is that in the Severn estuary there'd be built these huge lagoons where when the tides come in, the lagoons would fill, and then under controlled circumstances, at the time of peak need, the water would be released through turbines which would generate the electricity.
Yeah.
And this would, although it's expensive, it's broadly comparable to the cost of the equivalent amount of nuclear-generated energy, or would it be cheaper even?
It may even be cheaper. I mean, it's worth noting that the government's own chief scientists have recommended that this is a technology that needs to be investigated because its potential is so big. And it doesn't have that environmental negative that building the barrages right across the estuaries do. And it generates 100% reliable electricity. We know for centuries to come where the moon is going to go around the Earth, and the tides are going to follow that moon, and therefore we can rely on that electricity 100%.
And no decommissioning costs, no radioactive waste.
No radioactive waste. The decommissioning is, all you're talking about is a reef that actually could be used. It could be used to put wind turbines on. It could be used as a nesting ground for wild birds. It can be used as a fishery, all sorts of things. So there's no long-term radioactive problem. It's a very clean technology.
And apart from the Severn estuary, what other estuaries might be developed for tidal pools? Well,
Britain has some of the best estuaries in the world in terms of tidal range. We don't have a problem that many countries have with our estuaries freezing up in winter either. The problem we do have, and it's worth remembering this, is that Britain's estuaries are amongst the jewels in the crown of our wildlife habitats, and many of them are important bird reserves. So we have to be careful. But places like the North Norfolk coast, places like the Irish Sea, off Liverpool and the north of Wales, the Severn Estuary, are all suitable for tidal lagoons, and are all places relatively near to big population centres where we could build this sort of facility. Even the Thames Estuary, for example, near London.
Yeah. Okay, looking at another option, wind power.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it briefly, but you could just give us a flavour about how much energy could be generated.
Well, as in theory, the potential is enormous if we go offshore, because Britain's the windiest country in Europe, and we have a vast continental shelf, relatively shallow seas in the North Sea, in the English Channel, and in the Irish Sea, that we could put wind turbines on. The question really is not so much how many wind turbines we could build, but how many at what cost. Our estimates suggest that we can get about 12.5 nuclear powers worth of electricity, nuclear power stations worth of electricity by 2030. And that's building arrays that are largely out of sight, don't present an eyesore, but still relatively near to big population centres, like the Thames Array. It's in the Thames Estuary near London.
Yeah. Well, can I just correct you there? I mean, I think they're quite beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't think them as an eyesore at all. I don't want to see them in major beauty spots, but I think offshore, when I look out and see them, the ones off the Norfolk coast, for example, they look beautiful.
Yeah,
and in fact, I would like the artists to be commissioned to decorate them and design them and paint them in all kinds of interesting ways. But that's another issue. Yeah. Okay, so quite clearly, wind can provide roughly what percentage of our, well, in theory, 100%.
Yeah, more than 100% if you look at the theoretical potential. But economically speaking, in the next 30 years, we're talking about more than replacing our existing nuclear resource. We're talking maybe 20%, 25%, something like that. And then the next one we can look at is the marine wave and tidal current. And that's, again, could give you maybe another 20%, something like that, of our supply.
Can you just explain how wave power works?
Essentially, we're talking about either something that sits on the waves that saps their energy a little bit by bouncing up and down and generating electricity through that upward and downward movement, or in terms of tidal current, we're talking essentially about a wind farm underwater. Big turbines that are underwater that, as the water pushes through them, can be used to generate electricity. And again, the potential, according to the Carbon Trust, was about 20% of the UK electricity supply, which is quite a significant amount. And again, that sort of potential is relatively reliable, and that's something that is very important in terms of generating supply.
And in terms of construction costs and maintenance costs?
At the moment, it's more expensive, and that's the problem we've got. But prices are coming down. And this is where I think we need to look to the future and make some...
When you say more expensive excluding the decommissioning costs of nuclear power and the preservation of the waste.
It's a difficult one because nobody really knows the full costs of keeping waste in a safe form for 20,000 years. Certainly, it's coming down to within the price range that the government would consider to be acceptable for generating electricity within the next 10 to 20 years. And so it's something that we should be exploring, but it's not the only technology. I mean, there are lots and lots, and this is the great thing about renewable power. There are lots of different sorts of technologies. We haven't even talked about solar yet.
Okay.
Whereas the Germans, I mean, solar is one where the prices are really coming down fast. Solar was, after wind, the second fastest growing source of electricity worldwide last year, according to International Energy Agency figures. So solar has enormous potential if we can build it into existing buildings. And people like Solar Century, a London-based company, are beginning to put solar tiles on roofs so that when people replace the tiles on their roofs, they actually buy solar panels that will generate electricity. There are people in Imperial College in London that are designing solar-powered glass that will act both as an air conditioner by shielding you from the sunlight, but also power your air conditioning in the summertime by actually taking some of the energy out and generating electricity with it. So there's a huge range of different solar technologies that are coming on stream, and costs are coming down 10 to 100-fold and are expected to come down even further.
Okay, now a lot of people are going to say, well, solar's fine, but it won't work in Britain with our climate. Can you tell us about Germany, which has a comparable climate, in fact, much colder in winter? They're doing great on solar.
Absolutely. They've got a huge solar program. In fact, it's now forecast that they'll be generating as much electricity within the next 5 years by solar power as we currently generate by nuclear.
How are they doing that?
How are they doing that? They're doing that with subsidies. They're doing it with what's known as a feed-in tariff, where the suppliers get in a guaranteed supply, a price for their electricity. It's not actually that different from what the nuclear industry is looking for in this country. But the great thing to remember about solar, though, is people think, well, the sun doesn't always shine. That's not important. The sun is still coming through the clouds, and the solar panels are still producing electricity, even on a cloudy day.
I understand that under the new German legislation, which has been enforced a couple of 2 or 3 years, that domestic users now get paid above market rates for the electricity they generate and feed back into the grid. And so there's a positive incentive for individual households to have solar or wind.
Absolutely. And this is one of the big challenges for Britain, because one of the disadvantages of our centralised electricity generation system, at the moment we get most of our electricity comes from power stations. You know, people are used to the idea of the power station. In the nuclear case, the power station, obviously, because people aren't really very happy about having them next door, is usually a very, very long way away from the nearest big settlements. And yet, the power stations lose energy not only through transmission, moving the electricity from one place to another. It's about 10% of our electricity gets lost that way. But most importantly, the process of electricity generation creates a vast amount of heat. And most of the energy created both by coal-fired power stations and by nuclear power stations is lost as heat that goes straight up into the atmosphere. And so we can actually achieve a greater, more efficient generation of electricity if we can generate electricity right next to the places where people live and exactly when they want to use it. And solar and wind in people's homes can do that, can help balance the electricity supply by adding electricity generation very, very close to where people live.
What are the other options? I mean, hydropower?
Britain has hydro already, about 5 to 10%, I think, no, sorry, less than that comes from hydro. The potential for quite large hydro, the big sort of hydroelectric dams that we've seen, is relatively small. Most of the potential has already been used in this country. But there's potential for using our rivers. The Queen now is generating electricity at Windsor Castle through what's known as a rolling river hydro, where you put essentially like a wind turbine under the river, in the bed of the river, and the water flowing down the Thames turns the turbine round, and that generates electricity for Windsor Castle. I've seen plans and suggestions, and I've seen some of the schemes for very, very small streams. I know somebody who lives up in Bedfordshire who generates all the electricity from his house from the stream that runs at the bottom of his garden. And there are plenty of rural areas in this country where we've got, particularly in the west and the north, where we've got streams coming off mountainsides, and all we need to do is to put piping underground to divert some of the water from those streams when they're in flood in wintertime, and they usually are in flood in wintertime, to go down maybe 100 feet, and that can generate large amounts of electricity for supplying local areas. Then there's the weirder ways. I mean, one of the examples that's been talked about is getting electricity from our gas network. It's called hydropressure. And we have a gas network that distributes natural gas to people's homes, and in about 1,400 different places, the pressure on the pipes, on the gas, has to be reduced because it goes from quite a thick pipe that takes it through the main transmission networks down to the quite thin pipes that actually take the gas into people's houses. Normally, they do that through pushing the gas through a valve that reduces its pressure. But actually, you put a turbine instead of that valve, and you can generate about 2 megawatts, which is equivalent to a nuclear power station, if we did that for the whole country, by putting turbines in there and generating electricity from the reduction in pressure from the natural gas. It's already been done in Switzerland, it's been done in Italy, it's been done in America, and there's no reason why we shouldn't do it here. And the great thing about it, of course, is that people's use of electricity correlates very, very closely in terms of time of day and days of the year with their use of gas. So that the times that people are most likely to be using gas when they're running the bath in the morning is actually the times when most gas is going through the system, and therefore these turbines will be going around faster and faster and faster, and the most electricity will be generated.
Other options?
All sorts. I mean, we talk about thermal insulation, you know, in terms of energy efficiency in particular. I mean, there are all sorts of technologies we've not talked about. Geothermal in terms of energy generation is one. Limited potential in this country. It's a big potential in Iceland. And we should remember that, you know, we can import energy. And although we've lived for the last 30 or 40 years, and traditionally, you know, in the Victorian times, this country was a domestic producer of energy, there's no reason that we couldn't import some the way they do in Germany and Italy and places like that.
So
Iceland has huge potential for geothermal, and is talking about developing what they call a hydrogen economy, where they use their geothermal energy to create hydrogen that is then transported around the world and maybe powered in fuel cell cars in the long run, or burnt in power stations. Then you've got plans like being talked about for things like concentrated solar power, enormous towers being built in the desert in the Sahara, and these towers, essentially what happens is that the air underneath them is sucked up them by the difference in heat between the top and the bottom, and that goes zooming up, and you put the turbine in, it pushes the turbine around, and it's a vast amount of power, simply because the area of the Sahara is so big, and a very, very big proportion of Europe's electricity could in theory be generated that way over the next 30, 40 years if we put the investment in.
And on that option, this is the idea of having these huge, gigantic sort of mirror farms.
Yeah, exactly.
That concentrate the sun's rays on these towers to heat them. Yeah,
exactly. And the potential is enormous. And already there's trials going on in places like Israel, places like California, where they've got the right conditions. There's no reason, since we import gas and oil anyway, there's no reason why we shouldn't also import, in certain cases, electricity. And that can be done in this way. All those systems can generate hydrogen, could be used to produce hydrogen that could be shipped not far from places like Algeria and so on, and used in our new hydrogen economy. To be honest with you, I think those things are going to be 30, 40 years down the line. But they're technologies that we can use, and I think they're technologies that are getting cheaper, and all of them, and when you add them up, all provide solutions that, a mix of solutions that means we don't need nuclear power.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Roger. I think you've set out very clearly a range of different renewable energy options, safer, cleaner, greener, and often cheaper. Mm-hmm. And I hope that perhaps the government will be hearing what Friends of the Earth is saying and not be so besotted by the nuclear option, and instead look at the renewable sources right on our doorstep, which would provide us a multifaceted range of energy sources with safe domestic generation. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for watching. Please join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.